Okay, here I am. Yeah, so exploring identity through character mechanics in JRPGs. So I'm Destina, developer, designer, narrative designer, and player and analyst of probably too many JRPGs. Um, First thing I want to get across with this talk is that I don't expect specific knowledge of either psychology or JRPGs, though probably anybody who has the latter will appreciate the examples more. And anyone with the former will cringe as I casually butcher anything you've learned. I will I mean, let's start by kind of properly defining my terms. What is identity? Honestly, I apologize to anybody who saw my last talk. You maybe saw this joke coming a mile away. If I could properly and succinctly define it, I might not be giving this talk, and I might not be personally using games to explore it. Instead, I find that generally I really only have questions. When I think about identity, I think about what are the fundamental building blocks of a person? How many different ways can that be answered? And how does this translate into interaction with the world? How does that become kind of concrete? What makes a person, what makes you unique? What is shared with others? What social groups do you belong to? And then I think about growth and change. What does it mean in relation to identity? How do you do it? What are the mechanics of that? How fixed or fluid is identity over time and just moment to moment? I also think about how does one identity feel different to another? What do we gain by constructing identities, and what do we lose? So that seems really kind of heavy and daunting for a 2-hour talk. I'm not going to answer these questions. Instead, I'm here to share these questions and some of the discussions and thoughts that I've had around them, as well as kind of provide examples where I can kind of from JRPGs and sort of talk about what they inspired in my thoughts in this space. All of these things have been inspired for me by character mechanics in JRPGs specifically. So let's talk about that. What do I mean by character mechanics in JRPGs? What's a JRPG? Japanese role-playing game. As a genre, I find it more useful as a general descriptor than as hard and fast boundaries. I can spend a lot of time on this. I have. So right now, I'm just going to take a quick kind of cop-out answer. If you have any experience with these games, if you could maybe possibly call it a Japanese role-playing game, if it looks like any of these sorts of things, it's probably a JRPG or a close relative. And if that sounds really hazy or you don't have experience with these things, really don't sweat it. Don't sweat the details. Don't worry about it. There will be examples throughout the talk as relevant, and I'll try to kind of introduce them. For people who do know JRPGs a little bit better, I do want to acknowledge that there's a lot of Final Fantasy in this talk, which is one particular franchise. Partially because they've been around almost since the beginning. They are clear and well developed, and they specifically make an effort from game to game to change or shift their systems, which often surfaces, whether on purpose or by accident, interesting new lenses on identity in the process. I will always try to point out and draw from other sources when I can, because I do genuinely find this to be a quality of JRPGs in general, not just the Final Fantasy brand, and I don't like holding up one brand as the exemplar of JRPGs. So I've kind of casually defined JRPGs. I really haven't defined identity. My talk title is a little bit rubbish so far. Sorry about that. I can be a bit more specific with character mechanics, though. So character mechanics, here are the rules and systems that are attached to individuals in the game. So individual entities, which we can kind of reasonably identify as characters, which define both how that character interacts with the other game elements and how the player comes to understand the characters as parts of the game, as pieces of the game. So these might be, so for a few examples, these might be stats with numbers. You see a few of them like on the slide. It might be a leveling system. It could be kind of skill systems or any number of other quantities or qualities with game meaning specifically attached to characters. The mechanics might describe how the characters fight, how they move, or how they change. And you might ask at this point, why character mechanics in JRPGs specifically, besides the fact that I am clearly obsessed with JRPGs and character mechanics are a part of that. So why not? I have found it to be kind of a really interesting lens, and I've got 2 hours to talk about it. So clearly there is something there, at least meaningful for me, and hopefully you can take something out of that. But like, honestly, a little bit more objectively, I think that JRPGs try varied and unique things in this space of character mechanics, especially related to identity, just by nature of focusing on characterful stories, often with ensemble casts told through more than just their words. They do always attempt to convey narrative through every aspect of the game, and that includes the mechanics. Honestly, I'm sure a similar talk could broaden to different sorts of games, but even just narrowing this down, I have plenty to talk about. Most importantly, I think to make these games is to put into practice ideas and assumptions about identity, whether that's the author's intent or not. You're condensing and systemizing characters and handing them to strangers to inhabit in service of shared stories and experiences. And I just don't think you can do that without putting into practice ideas and assumptions about identity. To play these games is to engage on some level with those assumptions and ideas, whether that's the player's intent or not. So maybe as a player, you reject those. Maybe like you recognize them, but you're like, I think this isn't meaningful to me, or in general. Maybe you choose to assign them little weight. Maybe you don't think about it. Maybe you favor sort of an abstract or gamey interpretation. Maybe you accept them, again, whether you intend to or not. I also, I have mentioned this in a past talk, I think JRPGs often invite the player to think about their personal relationship with the game by explicitly and sincerely breaking the fourth wall. So this meta acknowledgement of the player, for me, nudges reflection on self and identity into the realm of relevant subtext, not just something I'm kind of, I could talk about this and that would be valid, but I don't think that that it is completely divorced from what these games think they're doing, even if I think that justification is not totally necessary. So here, for the next hour and a bunch, I'm going to bring these assumptions, which the author puts into practice and the player engages with, those ideas and choices, to the forefront. I'm going to put them next to each other, question them, see what questions they bring out. The answers to these questions will definitely be subjective, and they may even be personal. I'm certainly not the first person to provide this kind of analysis, but hopefully what I'm bringing will be interesting and useful to you, just as these questions have been for me. At the very least, I think these can act as a new or modified lens on game design, whether in JRPGs or otherwise, whether you're a player, creator, or both. And in my case, it's actually these have acted as new or modified lenses on identity itself, which has gone well beyond the games that inspired them. So that's the preamble. As I get started, I want you to keep in mind that this talk is about identity and a particular niche of game design, but it's also about transforming hard boundaries into explorable fuzzy spaces. I'm gonna come up a few times. So let's dive in. Stats. So these are perhaps the most direct application of mechanics to identity. So like, here's a bunch of stat screens. It's those like, what I'm talking about are those way too many numbers on a character summary screen, which are supposed to communicate something to the player. You combine a label, like for example, strength, with a number, and you repeat that until you have what you think is a complete picture of the character, or at least a complete picture of a character's game utility. Sometimes that number is used in formulae to decide additional numbers like damage in battle. Sometimes that number is used to decide something like a likelihood of success at a task. Always, these are assumed to be kind of within the fiction of the game, real aspects of these game individuals. And these numbers and labels either affect or reflect their interactions with the game world. Now we can look at what specific labels have existed or persisted, but sometimes I actually find this really dull. It's one of the less interesting aspects. There are really clear roots in Dungeons and Dragons. Anything that is or looks like strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, charisma. And you have holdovers from other games which build off each other and they copy. And in these cases, so I could say there's kind of a lack of imagination there, but often it's because there's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of numbers. Sometimes it's a bit ambiguous what these numbers mean. The labels themselves don't exactly tell you what they do necessarily, unless you've played other games like this. And so they play off of player familiarity. If you've seen strength in other games, you kind of at least have an instinct of what strength means in this game. And that isn't particularly unique to JRPGs. I just kind of want to acknowledge that history. Dungeons and Dragons obviously is a JRPG. It inspired lots of Western RPGs. It inspired lots of game mechanics in general. I also think it's a bit on the nose in portraying a worldview of what qualities an individual can leverage to be effective or successful. We don't often see in a lot of these games like an empathy stat, and I think that kind of parallels how the designers might not know how that exactly translates to success in their game model. But we can, with all those aside, we can look at how different games treat stats differently. And in doing so, I can sort of lay the foundations for how we're going to approach identity through character mechanics in the rest of this talk. So we start by taking an element of the game that's assigned to characters, and we look at examples. We have the stats I already mentioned, but let's have some new ones. So sometimes the labels can get fantastical, like magic. In some games, it can be highly specific, sort of utilitarian, leaning more towards describing a game mechanic as opposed to being evocative of a character, of an identity trait. So this might look like attack and defense. Sometimes it gets incredibly specific, like top spin and slice in the case of a tennis JRPG. So we've laid these out. We've looked at some examples. Then we can ask why this number, why this name. We can note that some of the functions of these labels include creating a feeling out of a number, and in doing so, bridging the gap between a player's instincts and the hard programmed rules of the game. So there's a bit of utility there, being measurable and meaningful. And there's a bit of instinct, kind of a less clearly defined feeling, which will be different from player to player, depending on their experience both of games and what they think of these labels. And identity has some parallels there. By kind of talking about or describing identity, by trying to define it, we make bits of ourselves and others concrete, knowable. We try to make it consistent or solid so we can talk about it, so we can relate. But ultimately, in doing so, we're relying on instincts and feelings to lead the way more than hard and fast rules. It might be tempting to disregard stats which seem largely and solely descriptive of efficacy in the game, like attack or defense, like I mentioned. But sometimes a story of identity is encouraged or comes to mind, even with those stats. So you can think about a character with high defense and think about what sort of stories that might bring to mind. And often you'll find that there is a relationship in a game. Do they put up personal walls socially? Do they use that defense to protect others? Do words like stalwart come to mind? In cases where there is, we can split that up further. In cases where there is, say, physical and magical defense, which is often a distinction made in these games, what does it look like to have one and not the other? And it can kind of point us at what does magic represent in the system. And I'll get back to magic shortly. Finally, we can question these facets. We can poke at them in light of our own ideas of identity. We can ask how much this lines up with our own personal experience. Do I feel like I have that number? Do all people have these numbers? What numbers are missing? Is a number even the right form for this? So in a general sense, the pattern of attaching a name and story to numbers helps us collectively talk about and share things about ourselves and others. At the same time, it also encourages hierarchies and ranking. So you see this often among certain kinds of players talking about best builds, useless characters, in games where, like for a lot of JRPGs, that's not really necessary. You're not, the game is not requiring that you kind of optimize or use a very specific loadout to kind of experience the game as a whole, to experience the story, to enjoy it even. I would argue in JRPGs, it's not really the point, though, like if this is the fun that some people draw from it, that's fine. In those cases where there are kind of hierarchies and ranking and characters or character traits that are dismissed, a character's perceived inefficacy can reflect on their quality as an individual in the narrative, even if nominally those things can be a little bit separate from each other. We can sometimes claim to separate a character's narrative qualities and their mechanical qualities, but I think that can be a little bit disingenuous. I also think that sometimes we can do similar things outside of games, but I hope we do. So I mentioned magic. It comes in a few times, and I find when I approach magic in these games, it's always worth asking why. What does magic mean? What might it be a stand-in for? Why did they have to allude to something fantastical instead of pulling from something more everyday? In some cases, it seems to represent kind of smarts, intelligence, as opposed to brute force. In others, it more subtly stands in for the abstract or the unseen, as opposed to the concrete and tangible. We can give it different names. If magic is called mana, it has some connection to natural force or nature. If it's called, say, magitech, and it's been refined, studied, commoditized. It's also always worth looking at which characters have it as part of their identity and who it's withheld from. In any particular game, is it the geeky scholar who leans on magic? Is it the mysterious woman, the exotic native? Is this an acknowledgement of unseen power, or is it a kind of othering, a way of communicating, I'm sure they've got something going on, but it's sort of foreign and unknowable? We can take a moment to think about how all of these questions relating stats and what they represent, what they evoke in terms of identity. Are there any stats we could do without, for example? So I'll go on a bit of a personal side here. I kind of hate wisdom as a numbered category. So it definitely expresses something useful as a concept, perhaps that some approach or bit of logic that is apparently correct might also be short-sighted. But in practice, I find it always seems that it's used as an excuse to be esoteric or non-specific, and that you might have multiple bits of wisdom which contradict each other, and you can only tell which is actually sort of wise in hindsight, at which point everybody kind of nods sagely and says, yes, that was wise and this was unwise. When an individual gets labeled as wise, as having wisdom, they have that number attached to their identity, Listening to them and looking for the interpretation of their words, which works out, can become somewhat self-fulfilling. Someone gets labeled as unwise, and suddenly we're scrutinizing even apparently good plans based only on how they may fall apart. So what's the takeaway from my entire personal tangent? Probably, as you might guess, I'm not often called wise, first of all, and I'm not likely to be reaching for wisdom as a stat in my games. But I also appreciate having played with it in games because it helps me explore the ideas around wisdom and what it means outside of games and what others might assign that to. It creates a conversation between me and the people using these as to what they think wisdom looks like. On the other hand, to take a positive example, think about the words focus or concentration. So these categories really resonate for me. I have an idea what they feel like personally, and in my experience, they can vary from person to person, something we might kind of attach a number to. I can even imagine what a power-up or a temporary decrement to these things might represent, which is useful when you're kind of designing or playing a game. I might use these as a basis for a character stat if I were making a game like this, and I might bring them up if I'm discussing identity with people more casually. However, we can go one step further. If I'm going off my personal experience also tells me that assigning a single you have it or you don't number to, say, focus might not be quite right. I could imagine, for example, having a sliding scale where on one end you have focus and on the other you have multitasking. Sometimes looking like there is a lack of something might actually mean there is an abundance of something complementary. And this is actually used in the Big Five or Ocean model of personality traits. So this is a real model, psychological model for measuring identity, measuring personality. To pull this back a little bit though, my point broadly is not that all JRPGs or games should discard one label and adopt this other label, or that there is a right and wrong way to do character stats. My point is, by choosing what we call these game numbers, by playing with and experimenting with different labels, we learn about our lenses on the world. We learn about our lenses on the inner workings of a person. And once we see those lenses, we can pull them out. We can question them, we can modify them, or we can even discard them. So we can dig a little bit deeper. There's a couple of interesting specific cases. So sometimes you get stats which are character specific, not just game specific. In a game called The Last Remnant, you have a few pretty standard stats with all characters. So like strength, intellect, and speed. These are like bread and butter stats for JRPGs at least. Then each character has a final unique attribute. You've got a couple of them there. So like brawn and dedication and hardworking. You also, like, there's a ton of playable characters in this game. You have Crybaby. There's a stat, fashion sense. There's a stat for willpower. And there's a stat for zest. One character has zest. It's great. At that point, it almost doesn't matter what the number is. It's just the label itself just says everything. There are so this is fantastic. And there's one that really annoys me. So there are many playable characters, but there's sort of like a core group of primary playable characters, and there's one primary female playable character, of course. And she is a complete stoic badass. And her individual personal characteristic is love. And like, you could say that that's a masterful character note, but it also mostly annoys me. Like it's the female stat. In The World Ends With You, there is a stat called bravery. So that's not revolutionary. You might have seen that in other games. What it determines in this game is what equipment you can wear. So higher bravery, you can wear additional kinds of equipment. So if you've played other RPGs, maybe this feels a little bit like an encumbrance stat. However, here's the twist. The World Ends With You is a modern urban fantasy, and its all about style. All the equipment consists of trendy attire, like they have like imaginary brands. Higher bravery often means flashier or more feminine coded. So there is one playable female character. Oh God, this is already turning into a pattern. And she is the only character who starts with high bravery, which allows her to wear much of the obviously great feminine coded equipment, while the other male coded characters can increase their bravery throughout the game to one day aspire to wear that amazing goth dress with great stats. Now that certainly says a thing or two about gendered identity and coded clothing. And it's possible that I just wanted to point that example out. There's no takeaways from it besides that it's amazing. But I think it does illustrate how one can be more exploratory while still having a clear explanatory purpose and linking to perspectives on identity. So sometimes we get stats like affinity to an element. So affinity, this can just be a gamey conceit, but you could also consider like outside of games when elements are used to codify traits. So if you know like Avatar: The Last Airbender, you kind of have an idea of what I'm talking about, like the Fire Nation, the people are all sort of a certain way. Before, when we were looking at stats, we were looking at individual traits that are all independent of each other. But now we're packaging a set of traits under a single umbrella. So for example, fire is attack, and it's sort of aggressive, maybe a bit direct. And this is interesting because I think this is a really important aspect of identity outside of games as well. Which facets do we conceive of as being correlated, or even just different words for the same thing, and which are independent? Got more examples of this in a later section, so I'll kind of leave that off. But it sort of brings to mind all sorts of ways we approach identity, some which are more rigorous than others, but all of them are kind of persistent and compelling. Think of casual personality tests or astrological signs, or more formal categorization systems like the Big Five that I showed earlier. And I kind of find this interesting already. How many different ways can we split up and group up stats? Which ones belong together, are evocative, like already serve an explanatory purpose? Which ones do we think belong together but turn out not to be so tied in your personal experience? Like they get grouped together on like often, and then you stop and you take a moment and you ask yourself in your personal experience, oh wait, well, I know somebody who is this but not this. Why are those clustered together? Does it vary from culture to culture, from person to person? Before I wade kind of too far into the weeds here, consider what happens when we package identity traits consistently and poorly. Perhaps because we don't realize we're packaging them at all, or because we're trying to pull a fast one by packaging maliciously, because we're trying to make a point. Think about commonly packaging a set of identity traits which should be independent with where a person is from, the color of a person's skin, or what kind of genitals a child is born with. We should care, if only because not all ways of packaging identity are benign. And I don't think that means we should never package identity traits at all. For one, I don't think we can really help it. Like, I mean, if you look at social media, the number of personality tests, like you're never going to get rid of those, ever. But even if we can, understanding the myriad ways in which we define and cluster identity can give us personal mechanisms in order to bring out what you might see as kind of the best in ourselves, or just what you want to in yourself. It helps us understand and relate to and appreciate others. The key, I think, here is to be aware that we do it, when we do it, and how it might be different. And as I hope I'm illustrating, character mechanics in JRPGs can kind of help us examine that in a slightly removed space. Games can be playful and they help us explore these things. In addition, exploring identity in this way can also give us a roadmap for understanding how we grow and change, and there are very distinct character mechanics for that. People change. People don't really change. I've actually heard both stated as kind of factual common knowledge truisms. Perhaps you have as well. In most JRPGs, characters mechanically grow over time. Depending on how you're defining JRPGs, they have levels or growth over time in all of them. Those numbers that we've been talking about before, they go up. In many of these games, characters change, gaining new abilities, swapping old abilities for new ones. The ways in which they do this, the ways in which this is understood by the player, the way this is mechanized, is varied. And I think those variations have a lot to say about the stories we tell ourselves about how we do or don't change. So you are probably familiar with this one, whether or not you know anything about JRPGs. It predates them. It has bled into many facets outside of games. I mean, you can see this in exercise apps, experience, and leveling. Characters take action. They gain experience. They reach new plateaus of skill and power. You rinse, lather, repeat. It's simple. It evokes ideas of practicing something to get better at it. In some of the earliest versions of this in JRPGs, Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest, for example, characters were on a fixed path, and that path led up to more and greater power. And this can seem like just sort of an early conceit. Game design and tech were simpler, so the systems were simpler. However, elements of this kind of live on today. And here's a question. Is it your personal experience that you just get better at everything with age? A little bit rhetorical, maybe. How far does this extend? Do you have more influence on the world with age? Like, what other definitions of better do you have here, of power? Is it your personal experience that putting in time and effort will always inevitably reap rewards? It's not mine. Perhaps this system speaks to a fantasy of identity, one where we collect and grow and never lose. And there is nothing wrong with holding or experiencing that fantasy. I personally like to call out and recognize that fantasy explicitly, lest we sort of think it is the only or correct way. How linear and inevitable is that path? This is something that can be addressed narratively, but I think it equally important to think about how it is baked into character growth systems. So you could have narrative, you could have like a straight line, you get more powerful over time for the player, and then have narrative ups and downs for the characters. But I think it can be very powerful to think about how it is baked directly into the character growth systems. So I've got a quick aside here. If you've never had the pleasure of discovering that there are philosophical texts written about the concept of queer time and how those who identify as queer often experience maturation and path of life differently, then I highly recommend brewing some nice tea and enjoying some reading when you can find the time. Honestly, if nobody has made an experience or leveling system inspired by queer time yet, I really hope I personally get around to it. But this isn't the only way that characters grow in JRPGs. So even, perhaps especially in early games, there was experimentation, and a lot of it. So the Saga series of games stands out to me. In early Saga games, you had different types of characters. You can see a bunch of them there. And they grew in different ways. So some grew via buying power-ups, like money as character growth, yuck. But some grew only according to the things that they specifically used. So like in game terms, you would repeatedly wield a weapon that used strength, and you could randomly grow strength by doing that. There was no explicit experience or level, There was no one number which represented your absolute power. And growth came kind of unpredictably. Some character types gained random abilities or vulnerabilities with basically no warning. Especially as the Saga series progressed, often this kind of learn by doing, but a little bit at random, has been coupled with a factor built into the game, which ensured that you were far more likely to grow in more challenging circumstances as opposed to trivial circumstances. So in some cases, in some of these games, you could not grow at all without being in extreme circumstances, say fighting a boss. This, of course, evokes the idea that we learn by constantly challenging ourselves. And this is sometimes echoed in more modern experience and level systems by scaling experience explicitly by the relationship between a character's level and the level of the challenge. But I find that the details here are what really matter. What exactly does it mean to be challenged? Does it mean that the task you're carrying out is not trivial? Does it mean that there is a chance of failure? Does it mean failure is likely? And can your character grow through failure or only success? In JRPGs generally, it's only success which provides character growth, though of course the player themselves may gain new insights and skills through repeated failure. Perhaps even more fascinating in some Saga games were the non-standard characters. So you could have robot characters, and they didn't spontaneously grow at all, unlike all the other characters. Instead, their stats increased to suit the equipment you gave them, like you were giving them upgrades. So that same sword that increased strength, if like you gave it to one of the sort of human characters and they wielded it, you would like put that on the robot, put it in their inventory, and their strength would all automatically go up a chunk just by having it. That equipment sort of became a part of them. That sword would have like a durability, and when you restored the robot, you would restore the durability of the sword. There were monster characters, like right there you can see like slime and baby dragon and imp. And they would change into other monsters or gain new skills by eating the remains of the foes you defeat. So like you are what you eat, but like entirely too literally. There are other characters labeled kind of human, and in this case, in this example, mutant. In like other Saga games, they're sort of labeled as mystics, which are sort of like immortal queer vampires. There were also like kind of accompanying genders you could choose, which like interestingly, it would affect kind of initial growth, like where you started, but not your maximum potential or your rate of growth. So that says something about what this person thought about gender and your physical capacity for things. All of these characters, when playing with them, all these character types, they felt different. Some might feel slow and consistent, inevitable. Others could feel frustratingly random and occasionally spectacular. All of these reflect thoughts on how identity can change over time that don't quite fit in the experience level model. You are what you do. You are what you eat. The material things you collect or use can change you, become a part of you. Even the idea that robots cannot grow of their own accord says something about how we identify ourselves compared to a semblance of life. Growth can come unexpectedly. And sometimes change can be negative, as in the case of gaining random vulnerabilities with no accompanying upside. Sometimes what doesn't kill you does not, in fact, make you stronger, no matter how frustrating that is as a player. That's kind of the tip of the iceberg with growth systems in JRPGs. I began to speak before about how we cluster character traits. And I think that's best signified in what many JRPGs adopt as what's called a class or job-based system. In these systems, you gain experience and levels, but for a specific collection of skills rather than universally. You don't have like a universal power number, you might not. You are instead good at this specific cluster of things. So you can imagine like knight or ranger or sage as a collection of skills and traits that all kind of relate to each other, all packaged together that you become good at together. You can also imagine, if you know JRPGs, all manner of Power Ranger colored mages, black, white, red, blue, green mage, and they all mean something different. In some of the more adventurous, you can imagine Patissier and Catmancer. So this is prominent enough that there are many different forms. It's not unique to JRPGs, but it's incredibly present and varied in JRPGs. What does a class or job represent? On the game side, it's a cluster of abilities and traits with a label or a story, kind of like what we've been talking about. Even just calling it a job, using that word, suggests how it relates to our identity, similar to a role or employment that we don that's separate from, but also tied to us, affects our identity. In some games, such as, say, Final Fantasy 3, 5, the Bravely Default series, jobs are presented as significant narrative entities which are gained and which provide new powers. Throughout the narrative, you find and earn these jobs. Oof, when I say that out loud, like, you should be thankful that you have earned this job. Oh God. This evokes some of the positives of identity. It can inspire us. It can put us adjacent to new traits as well as new people, which we can then adapt to, we can grow into over time. It gives us a little bit of a story of self. We grow at a collection of related skills. Of course, as I've alluded to, calling them jobs really suggests how much our personal growth is linked to doing our employment, which I have already somewhat explicitly stated my feelings on, but you may have been able to guess already anyways. The way different games handle the specifics of a job system raises interesting questions. It kind of illuminates assumptions about identity and gives us new ways of thinking about identity. So this is going to get a little bit nitty gritty on the specifics of job systems in JRPGs. Bear with me. So you can have jobs which you don, you learn from, and then only have access to while you are donning that specific job. So for example, you cannot use what you learned as a knight when you decide to be a mage. You swap and it's like, that's not there at all. This is how it is in Final Fantasy 3. You can have systems which allow you two jobs at once. So a job and a sub-job, something you spent time with in the past. You become a mage and you have access to your old skills as a knight or as a healer, but not both at the same time. For those keeping track, that's Final Fantasy 5. Then there are systems which let you mix and match individual aspects of your old jobs, just like pick and mix, to form your own unique style. So you might become a mage, but you keep the ability to equip shields from being a knight, and you have the kind of incredible movement abilities that from that small time that you spent as a thief. This is more reminiscent of a lot of tactics-based JRPGs like Final Fantasy Tactics. And it might sound like I'm sort of splitting hairs here, but what feels resonant and what feels restrictive, what feels fun and what feels real, all kind of play into a view of identity. We can talk about transferable skills like spreadsheet proficiency, sure, but also we can talk about transferable traits like a person's attention to detail, which they developed over time. When you take on a new role, move to a new place, take on a new identity, does it feel like little bits from past selves or one big outfit swap? How much control do you have over it? Can you freely mix and match those traits to suit a situation, or is it like you've got a clump and you put that clump in? And sometimes clustering traits in non-obvious or frankly ridiculous ways can give us new stories and the ability to grow in new ways. So anecdotally, I played that game with Patissier as a character job like in the game, you like in the middle of combat instantly make sweets and throw them at the enemy. Like you don't even get to eat them. And it gives them a variety of negative effects. So like it says a lot about what they think the value of sweets are. But you spend the rest of your time, even in battle, just collecting ingredients so that you can make more sweets and throw them away. I enjoyed the play style of the job so much in the game. Like it spoke to me. It's just like mechanically a thing I enjoyed, that I decided to take up baking myself. I had never really had the inclination to do that before, but this gave me a form. It gave me a story which I could connect to myself, even if I knew it was really silly. It's also possible I'm just highly impressionable. In some of the later job-based systems I mentioned, a single character is identified not just with the job they have now, but in some ways the jobs they have held in the past. So the journey that they've taken through the system. And this is both interesting as we explore identity, and it's also conveniently represented in some rather different growth systems. So identity as a journey. So far, we've addressed identity largely as a snapshot in time, either stats or clusters of traits like jobs. Then we started to see collections of jobs accumulated over your journey, not just I am a knight, but also, and I have been a mage. And this idea of identity over time as a journey taps into a different kind of character growth system. Growth represented as a path, sometimes branching, sometimes wide open, sometimes narrow and winding. Here explicitly, we can see growth as a journey on a map of sorts, and the restrictions and qualities of this map again say things about identity. I'm going to use a couple specific examples from Final Fantasy series because they slightly build off of each other and have different ramifications for our exploration of identity. Final Fantasy X represented character development by a thing called the sphere grid, which you can see right there. This is kind of zoomed in. This was a map with nodes, spheres. Each of the characters sits somewhere on this map. And then they use points earned in battle, a little bit like experience, to travel between the nodes along defined paths. When a character is at a node, they can activate it and gain whatever traits that node represents, which varies from stat increases like a bit more health or strength to magic spells and abilities like healing or like a quick attack. A character's growth over time could be viewed as their path through the sphere grid. I personally found there's kind of a special kind of magic in zooming out on the sphere grid near the end of the game, and you could just sort of take in all the characters' their journeys all at once across the sphere grid. Given that the paths could branch, sometimes just for a short sidetrack, sometimes towards a completely different section of the map, each character's journey of growth could be quite different. And this already paints a picture of changing identity as a journey, visualized as sort of movement through a space which is different from what we've seen previously. It's kind of a little romantic to me. It appeals to me both as a storyteller characterizing a journey and as a bit of a math geek, mapping a possibility space with nodes, edges, and graphical shaping of relationships. We can dig a little bit deeper though. We can look at some of the details of the sphere grid and the character's place in it a little bit more closely. So for one, not all places on the sphere grid are the same. While not explicitly marked, you could divide it into rough areas which corresponded to something like the character archetypes or jobs that we were talking about before. Within the area that roughly corresponded to the Black Mage, for example, you would find the series of spells making up black magic, so like offensive magic, lightning and ice and fire. And while you might find little boosts for all the stats, a character would receive proportionately more stats relevant to that job, like their magic attack. There is some intuitive logic to this, but I want to appreciate it in the larger context of our exploration of identity. Instead of clumping traits into strict buckets like the jobs, they're strung out along a path. There's little asides, there's connections to other possible paths, but at different points. We have the idea here that some traits and skills neighbor each other, have a closeness to each other. Perhaps they are related, one following on from or naturally springboarding to the other. At the same time, there's a bit more fuzziness here than having a strict linear path of growth, or like the buckets of jobs we had. Sometimes you make a short detour. Sometimes you travel a path backwards instead of forwards. Sometimes you come upon a locked path and you have to leave it for later. Sometimes you want to backtrack and you have to consider the energetic cost of retreading old ground versus just pressing on. Sometimes you reach a fork and you make a choice which profoundly changes the direction of your identity. So additionally, where each character starts on this map has profound implications. There isn't a specific beginning or end. It is not trivial to travel from one side to another. As you do, you pick up potentially character-defining stats and abilities. Even if one character were to make the journey to another character's starting point, and this often happens over time throughout the game, they would likely be quite different mechanically just through the act of making that journey. Often these starting points suggested a starting job of sorts for each character, something which played to their strengths or identity as a character, something which certainly played to their character design visually. While there were branches into other paths available, it took a bit of effort and time to make use of them. And you'll still have traversed a bit around their starting point, growing the character in the process. Without putting too neat a story to it, that starting point can represent so many things in our discussion of identity. It could evoke nature versus nurture. It could represent the circumstances in which you're born, or the circumstances in which you start a new branch of your personal journey. Whatever you think about the starting point of identity, it has profound implications for the journey. And for any among you who maybe know Final Fantasy X, maybe you're aware of or you've played the international release of Final Fantasy X, the one that was actually released in Europe. Maybe you played that first, or you're familiar with its release history. You might see where I'm going with this, or you might be a little bit confused as to this whole starting in different places. To catch everybody else up, in a later release of Final Fantasy X, they decided to allow all the characters to start mostly in the center of the sphere grid. So they kind of start very close to each other, not exactly in the same place, but very close. And it allows you to kind of journey off in whatever direction the player pleases. So there are pure game design considerations here for this choice. It's labeled as the expert grid, implying the player has more strategic responsibility, assumedly because you're kind of not handed a well-balanced party with each character starting separate from the others. For players replaying the game, they may be more interested in skipping right to a phase in growth where they have more immediate control over the character's growth instead of like slogging through that initial steps where it's more of a straight line. It also feels different in terms of the narrative of the growth of the characters, though. Personally, I didn't get along with it, at least conceptually, because it felt more like I was imposing my will on the characters rather than unearthing their journey or seeing them grow. By giving me, the player, more choice, more agency, I felt weirdly like it was being taken away from the characters. It also distanced the character mechanical abilities and traits from their personalities, which itself brings to mind fascinating conflicts which I grapple with in role-playing game systems constantly. There are certainly times when tying personal identity to abilities and traits can be unhealthy. It can lead both to stereotyped assumptions and what I consider a dangerous fallacy in equating personal worth with utility. it tells a slightly more rigid story of identity as well, what a character can or can't be. At the same time, personal identity does not spring forth from a vacuum. It's always embedded in a character or in a person, in a place and time, with sometimes very practical pushes and pulls. Moreover, the mechanics are just another tool of the game designer in conveying a narrative space to the player. To formulate a system where there aren't even symbolic links between character and their game mechanics always feels a little bit disingenuous to me. But there are uses to it, and it does distance it in these ways that are helpful. It's obviously not just binary one or the other. The sphere grid has even more nuggets to mine. I don't want to get too sidetracked here. I could talk about the labyrinth-like circular motifs which form the paths of the sphere grid. I could talk about the existence of special items which could activate nodes from other characters, or even teleport one character to the location of another, and what this says about how the people around us give us different paths in our identity. However, there are more examples of this kind of thing later. I have more to get on with. Let's move to a fresh example. I want to lightly dip our toes into Final Fantasy XII, where character growth exists on what is called the license board. So they were really into their kind of freelancers taking jobs fiction. It is somewhat similar to the sphere grid. There are a variety of complicating factors, though, that make it less interesting in my mind. It's another example of mapping character growth spatially. So you have all these squares, each of them represents a stat or a skill, and characters move along the grid. Interestingly, the sphere grid, the Final Fantasy X system, started with characters scattered about and had a version, like an updated version later, starting them all in the middle. The license board of Final Fantasy XII actually did the reverse over time. The initially reversed version started with everyone having the same license board, the same kind of map of character traits that they could do, and it was sort of up to the player to have them explore that map however they liked. There's a later version of Final Fantasy XII that added factors to differentiate the characters' license boards, to make them different, because apparently, just feedback-wise, it didn't feel good to players that the characters ended up too similar to each other. There are interviews with the developers on the matter, and they tend to point towards pure game design reasons for the change. But I would also guess that what feels bad from a game design perspective also has some overlap with what doesn't resonate from an identity perspective. In this case, maybe too much freedom of identity led to characters feeling similar to each other, which didn't resonate, despite playing into kind of unlock everything power fantasies or player expression. In many ways, identity can be just as much about what we can't do, the restrictions on our growth, as it is about what we can. It also, maybe, was a relatively cheap way to modify the game and make it feel different and sell more copies years later. Who could say? So, one more example of spatial character growth. Final Fantasy 13. Apparently, for this, like several in a row, they were really into their spatial character growth. Final Fantasy 13 used a system it called the Crystarium. I have more to say about Final Fantasy 13 a bit later. Some might say too much. But for now, focusing just on the Crystarium. Here's the quick version. You know nothing about this. Each character has a number of roles that they can develop. So sort of like the jobs we were talking about, but think like attacker, defender, healer, that kind of thing with very evocative names. Each of those roles has its own path per character. While the roles are not character specific, so multiple characters can be an attacker or a defender, which selection of roles is available to that character and what exactly that role means for that character is unique to the individual. So attacker for one character might be different than attacker for another character. And this character can be attacker, defender, healer, and this other character can be healer, defender, magic user. You earn points in battle, as usual, experience points again, and you spend those points filling out the path down whatever roles you like. It's spatial. There's kind of a path-like journey. It might seem pretty linear. It is pretty linear. At a glance, it is very stripped down. It allows less choice. It has more of a predetermined path. It's probably just less interesting than what we've already looked at. However, the way Final Fantasy XIII links the Crystarium to its narrative is special. So this is like the very specific narrative design link between the narrative and the character mechanics. Unlike the sphere grid and the license board, characters do not have all of their Crystarium available from the beginning. In fact, they don't have a Crystarium at all until a narrative moment representing, at least spiritually, the start of their journeys. Then, from that point on, bits of the Crystarium, say new roles or greater heights within a role, open up at different narrative milestones. Linear, okay, but specifically tying the character mechanical growth to their narrative growth. The sullen, go-it-alone soldier unlocks the medic portion of her Crystarium when she dramatically and reluctantly decides to nurture a relationship with a child rather than leave him behind entirely. She doesn't suddenly or drastically soften up, but nevertheless, she feels like, in the narrative, she suddenly gained the ability to be supportive or mentory in conversation when before she could or would not, which is appropriate since she also mechanically just gained the branch of her Crystarium, which allows her to heal others in battle. There are greater heights which become available for all the characters when a chapter ends, usually not just in some kind of boss battle, but a revelation or new twist on a character relationship. And this might sound really basic, but it's not just one dramatic moment and one new ability for one character. Consistently, the entire structure of the game and the character growth is linked. And to me, it added depth of meaning to an otherwise simple system. So in the previous systems, like the sphere grid or even the job systems, I think it's pretty easy to treat them as a separate independent thing from the character narratives and identities. They don't necessarily immediately invite this kind of identity, mechanical character growth investigation, even though hopefully I've convinced you can do it. It adds perspective, and for me, it distinguishes the interesting from the less so. But with the Crystarium of Final Fantasy XIII, we have a system that is actively difficult to appreciate without understanding its connection to the character's narrative. And which conversely, when you have that understanding, it really resonates because it's understood in the context of being a reflection of the actual narrative character growth. This is accomplished not through deploying a fancy new system. It comes from the details of the narrative game design, linking who gets what at what point in their story, while centering in the narrative the growth of the characters, personally and in their relationships with each other. Where the sphere grid ends up leaving you with a bunch of crisscross paths in a winding space, showing the journey, the Crystarium starts as a small personal crystal, a seed, and ends as an extensive multi-branched tree, reaching out towards others into the unknown. It's figurative growth made literal. And to this day, I enjoy thinking of my own personal identity as a tree representing my growth in a sprawling space of possible experiences. I've told this story up to now of Final Fantasy X, kind of like they did another version, it changed over time. Final Fantasy XII, they got feedback, they changed it over time. Final Fantasy XIII has a sequel. And you might be curious to know what modifications were considered over time to this system, how they modified it over time. Honestly, you're gonna have to hear it from someone else. I was furious with it. I really didn't like it. I don't care for it. You're not gonna hear it in this talk. I want nothing to do with the character growth system of Final Fantasy XIII too. Fine game. I have nothing to say about the character growth system. All of these systems though, they invite us to visualize and think of character growth. And by association, I think they invite us to visualize and think of identity. More like a journey, a person dragged through space and time. Sometimes they highlight or call into question beginnings and endings. They mechanize the details of that journey. What paths are open to us? How do we travel them? What conditions are necessary for new paths to open? I think it also invites thinking of identity growth in directions that are not just upwards, but sometimes sideways, spiraling inwards, nipping back around, or even parallel alongside others. So I've got one final stop on our journey, talking about character growth as a journey and what systems reflect this. In Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, your characters journey out every year to collect the energy necessary to shield your village from a dangerous and ever-present miasma. You journey out to new locations to collect myrrh, the dew that contains the energy you need. You return home, and time passes. You journey out again. You return to old locations, now changed. You return home, years pass. All the while, you keep a journal containing narrative snippets of your encounters, recording the highlights of your journey. Your character doesn't grow by fighting. They don't have level or experience points. Instead, at the end of each little adventure to a location, you pick a keepsake picked up along the way, a little artifact to remember the trip by. Each one is unique to its location and can only be gathered once. Each one represents a small change to your character's stats or abilities. Ultimately, your character's growth is largely determined by these tokens collected over your travels. Now, this might seem like a step back, or at least firmly to the side from the path through space mechanics I've spoken about up until now. However, while it is nice to zoom out of the sphere grid and look at the colorful lines which tell the full story of a character's growth, Crystal Chronicles reminds me that we rarely experience identity so cleanly, so perfectly remembered. There's a strong theme of memory and forgetfulness in Crystal Chronicles, and I think the single mechanic for character growth simply and poignantly reflects this. Instead of a perfect crystallization of your character's journey, you have these keepsakes, the individual tokens that you chose to represent every little adventure. How well do we remember the journey, which has contributed to our identities? How much becomes fuzzy because we forget or we subconsciously modify along the way? And is that a good or a bad thing? How much can little tokens act as reminders of the journey, anchors for identity? I began this section talking about character growth and identity represented as a journey. And in the process, a few new concepts have surfaced which deserve their own inspection. Specifically, there have been a few instances which invite us to think about personal identity beyond just the internal self. We nudged up against the idea of character growth through interaction with others a little bit in Final Fantasy X and 13, and there's some interesting character growth mechanics which relate directly to that. However, before we get to that, Crystal Chronicles puts forth the idea that there is a relationship between character growth and physical objects. And you may not be particularly surprised to hear we have mechanics for that too. So I talk a lot about character mechanics like stats, abilities, and levels, and what they say about identity. But there is often another character adjacent mechanic consistent across JRPGs, and in fact, RPGs and many other games. And that mechanic is equipment. So these are the tools and trappings external to the characters which affect how they can interact in the game. You've got the weapons and armor, accessories and doodads and thingamajigs, and you put them on and you take them off. You use them Maybe you even modify your stats with them. So these are interesting when thinking about identity, because they can often play in the same mechanical space, allowing skills or spells, modifying stats, but explicitly framed as not identity, as a thing to be picked up or swapped or discarded. Now, personally, I like to think that we can pull the same trick of picking up, swapping, and discarding with identity more than we might think, but I'll go into that a little bit more in a later section. If we lean on this concept of equipment for grounding character mechanics, I think it's helpful. There's like, it's really understandable, because I talk a lot, I've been talking a lot about identity. We've talked about memory. These things, we're trying to give them substance with character mechanics, but even despite that, they can feel a bit intangible. Real, definitely. Important, certainly, but also a bit untouchable. In Crystal Chronicles, growth, and with it a changing identity, was measured in tokens collected along your journey. And some games blur the lines further between what is a tool purely external to yourself and a part of the character, by allowing characters to grow via their interactions with the things they use. So here we've got Tales of Vesperia and Final Fantasy IX. Both of these tie character skills and abilities to pieces of equipment. So every sword has a skill or ability which you learn by using it. By equipping that specific sword for some amount of time, the character learns a skill which they can then use with or without the sword. The tools we use change how we can interact with the world, and perhaps over time, leave a mark even after we discard the tool. I might be making the, if the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail, a little bit too literal here. But beyond that, there are subtle aesthetic and mechanical choices which can shift equipment from being a binary identity or not identity to being in a space between, sometimes closer or further from being a part of identity. So how character specific is the equipment? Like, I mean, if it's a sword that 5 different characters can equip, it feels maybe a little bit less a part of their identity as to whether it's like a broomstick that one specific character can equip, and only one character. Feels a little bit more identifiable with them. How much does it act as a tool that is used, and how much does it act as a modifier on otherwise internal character mechanics? So are the modifications similar in nature to what you get with other character mechanics like leveling? Or are they qualitatively separate or different? Does the sword affect your attack while your levels affect strength? Or does the sword like raise your strength directly? Can feel a little bit more like an extension of yourself in that way. Anecdotally, my experience is that JRPG equipment tends to feel more like an extension of character identity, while equipment in more Western RPGs tend to feel more external or tool-like. But your mileage may vary. That's sort of my own feeling on it. I also don't want to draw too much of a conclusion from that, but I do want to point at it as yet another way that design can reflect thoughts on identity. Take another step. Sometimes the external tools with knowledge, so we have swords with skills in them. Sometimes they become more abstract. Sometimes they can become crystallized experience. So in Final Fantasy VII, you have this idea of materia, which are these gems, which are the crystallized sort of experience of the planet, imparting knowledge through osmosis, just by kind of having it around. You could have stones that are imbued with the expertise of generations, like the asterisks in Bravely Default 2. And we can say that these things are fantasy game conceits or mechanical constructs, but they're also an opportunity. So they're an opportunity to question the boundaries of our identity and explicitly think about the relationship between my identity and the physical trappings which reflect or affect it. Perhaps a souvenir helps to tap into an important memory which anchors a piece of identity. Perhaps a small home shrine grounds important feelings for a person or ideal in a real, tangible place. Perhaps a deck of pictorial cards helps to shake up or crystallize our thoughts and feelings in the moment. Perhaps a computer contains a text file that records personal facts and feelings from the last decade, which I definitely couldn't keep track of in my head otherwise. All of these act as extensions of ourselves. And for better or worse, perhaps acquiring a shiny new toy is important less for its utility and more for its relationship to personal and social identity. Is there like grand takeaway? What do JRPG mechanics teach us about this relationship? Maybe not much that we don't already know. But I do find that these mechanics allow us to explore that relationship, the fuzzy space where identity reaches out just beyond our bodies, and the tool becomes an extension of the self, where the self is defined by more than just the body. And obviously, when a game has no relationship between equipment and identity, well, that's a choice too. Individuals don't exist in a vacuum. We pass skills, stories, and bits of identity between us, borrowing or differentiating from those close to us, passing from teacher to student. There was a bit of this with paths opening when characters had narrative moments with other characters in Final Fantasy XIII, or having the ability to jump to other characters' paths to learn new things in Final Fantasy X. We've also seen growth by absorbing lessons from equipment, even very loose versions of equipment like special skill gems. But there are also entire growth systems built on the idea of absorbing knowledge by spending time with a guardian spirit, or spiritual mentor. In Final Fantasy VI and VIII, there exist beings called espers and guardian forces, respectively. Characters can gain abilities by partnering with them. In the case of espers, the character learns spells associated with that being, while also gaining the ability to call upon the esper for assistance in battle and gaining additional stats upon level. So again, we're packaging things here, and that says something. So for example, the esper Ifrit gives you fire magic, additional strength when you level, and can be summoned to do a big flashy fire attack. This is kind of a simple first take on the concept. You gain a spiritual mentor's blessing, and that spiritual mentor might represent many different things, maybe a literal teacher, but also kind of a cultural crystallization of traits, of concepts, of identity. While you adopt that spiritual mentor, you learn from them, they don't simply serve to teach you new tricks, they leave something of a permanent mark on you, something more subtle. They can be called upon in limited fashion when things get tough. You can channel them. It's still a very evocative step to the side from the jobs that we were using to cluster traits and skills before. It's also not far from here, learning from a spiritual mentor, to characters learning and growing via other characters. Guardian forces, or GFs, more substantially insinuate themselves into a character in Final Fantasy VIII. There are fewer GFs than espers, and the GFs themselves grow and change over time. They have more of an identity themselves. This growth is generally more important than character levels in Final Fantasy VIII. You do have character levels, but they have much less impact. So the vast majority of character mechanics are instead relegated to the GFs. You have actions, you have abilities, you have stats. They're all largely determined by the GFs a character has equipped, rather than their personal journey or like their skills or jobs or levels. In some ways, the GFs are more like donnable and combinable identities than mentors. That these can be exchanged between characters within the group is somewhat interesting as well. So I already mentioned kind of crystallization of cultural ideas, but this also suggests the growth of a collective fragment of identity within a social group, and that social group can be big or large. And it's available to any within the group. So for a maybe somewhat silly example, imagine you have a group of friends who have a shared concept of the snack maker or the entertainer, and the apparent traits and skills that go along with that. But instead of it being one individual within that group, you and each of your friends could pass that identity around. That's kind of what this is in this game. We can interpret these espers and guardian forces. Hang on. Yeah, okay. We can interpret these espers and guardian forces to reflect two somewhat different kinds of personal growth or change. So we can have mentors who are real physical people passing on knowledge, but also, whilst they do so, undoubtedly passing on bits of identity with it. We can also have spiritual guides, more ethereal entities which help anchor an ideal or a collection of traits. How much you personally relate to each of these may vary, of course. There's one nice little narrative detail of the GFs in Final Fantasy VIII, which has always struck me, kind of stuck with me. I want to share it. So there's a debate in the fiction, in the narrative, over the value versus the cost of using the GFs. These powerful entities don't just attach anywhere. They need space in the individual to take root, and they make this space in the memory. This is not represented mechanically, but it feels important and poignant nevertheless. So for all that we make sense of ourselves with identities and can draw power and inspiration from them, this reminds me to consider the costs of identity as a tool. It takes up space. It nudges out other things, other possible identities, or maybe even other broad interpretations of the relationship between self and other that eschews identity entirely. Now, these are not the only instances of spiritual guides or mentors in JRPGs. Final Fantasy XIII, for example, had eidolons, spirits that were linked to each individual character, kind of a guardian angel, who appeared to give that character a trial in their personal moment of transformation. In the Shin Megami Tensei and Persona games, they take the idea of inner demons and make that a little bit more outer demons, blurring the line further between this idea of a mentor and an actual representation of personal identity. Characters can often learn skills and magic from their demon or demons, but they also take on strengths and vulnerabilities of them. Sometimes these demons act as separate partners to the non-demon characters. Sometimes they're portrayed as manifestations of the characters. Let's take a step back. Growth of characters and identity. We've looked at experience and levels, linear paths of power and influence. We looked at clustering traits with a story via job systems and how we might piece together a unique self from those jobs. We've journeyed through visualizing growth as a path or journey. We've touched on the use of tokens and equipment as remembrances, additions, and extensions of character and personal identity. We've looked at growth from spirits and mentors, hinting at both group identity and growing via absorbing from others. On this last point, we ended on Shin Megami Tensei games and their fluid inner and outer demons. Some characters, most notably the main player avatar of the Persona games, can even swap between inner demons mid-battle to drastically change their abilities and affordances. Now, up until now, we've been talking about a kind of identity change which happens gradually over time, a kind of growth. But this swapping of identity demons at a flashy finger snap highlights something somewhat different. This is identity being fluid in the moment. And we have JRPG character mechanics to explore that too. We often speak of identity as a singular, mostly constant thing, the thing which binds us as individuals across time and separates one of us from the other. We allow for change over time, certainly, even if we're not sure how or when exactly that happens. Sometimes we allow for something a little bit external to join in and blur the lines of identity. This is reflected in all the character growth mechanics previously discussed. When we explore identity further or differently, we might understand identity as a mosaic, a bunch of pieces which are separate but fit together into something more. You also often may hear, or we can speak of, masks and allude to outer and inner selves, true and false selves. So this begs the question, how fluid is identity? Are we lots of things all at once, or a very narrow band? Are we one thing and only pretending at everything else? Does my identity change between morning and night? Does it change when I move from chatting with one friend to another? Can I change it consciously? How fluid can we imagine it to be? Does imagining it to be more or less fluid feed back in and affect how we see ourselves and how we act? Lines or fuzzy spaces? Or more likely, both and more. Here too, JRPG character mechanics can reflect and affect our stories of self. So let's start back on familiar ground with the job systems. So talked about them a little while ago, but please still remember them. You wear a wizard's hat and you cast magic. You put on a knight's helmet and defend your allies with sword and shield. Job systems already show a contrast between what you are or wear in the moment with a past history, what you have the potential to be. In these systems, you are not all the jobs you have been at all times. Instead, there are other versions of you which sit just on the periphery, waiting to be donned, while there are other identities you have no access to at all. But even those lines can blur. I've already mentioned one way in which lines between the jobs can blur. In one system, you don an entire job at a time. In another, you mix and match individual traits from your job. So the lines between the jobs are blurred. There are other ways we can fuzzy up the story of nice, neat jobs and identities, though. How about how often you can swap? In most of the previous games mentioned, job switching, shifting identity around, was a sort of rest activity. It's a thing relegated to menus between the moments of heavy action. Certainly not something you did kind of in the heat of battle. Compare that with Final Fantasy X-2. In Final Fantasy X-2, characters can, and frequently must, change their job mid-battle, sometimes swapping outfits with one of the other characters present. One of the critical, so like the character mechanics here, like it's a job system, very similar to the job systems I've already discussed. They're called dress spheres because obviously clothing, because it was an all-female cast. One of the critical tactical elements of the game is the arrangement of your jobs in a grid. So, yep, see that's right there. Determining what you can change to easily and which swaps are more difficult. So it was easier to swap to something that you positioned close on the grid than something a little bit further on. Sometimes swapping jobs mid-battle even provided additional bonuses. And that's kind of wild in an identity space to me, that the act of changing identity on the fly doesn't just provide options, like the different identities that you have available, but it has value in and of itself. When thinking about fluid identity, this game invites us to kind of shatter the binary notion that we are static or totally fluid, whatever we want all the time, and instead asks us to consider the qualities of being fluid. Which identities are close to each other, which are easier to slip into, which take more effort, which require coordination with other people. In Lightning Returns, the jobs the player constructs are called schema, which is like a great word. And the titular character must change between them in battle. You have 3 schema, and while a schema isn't being used, It recharges independently from the others. Your spare identities, sitting on deck, just waiting to be called, rest and reinvigorate until you bring them out. Incidentally, we've swapped our words from jobs or classes to schema. And schema, as a word, can be used in psychology to describe a mental structure of preconceived ideas, a framework representing some aspect of the world, or a system of organizing and perceiving new information, kind of like a concept of identity. Even more questions and qualities tumble forth when we consider not just the fluidity of a single person's identity, but coordination of identity between a group of people. In 10.2, only one character at a time could wear a job. So sometimes moving between jobs meant trading with someone else. Some amount of coordination was necessary. After all, we absolutely wouldn't want outfits or identities to clash. In Final Fantasy XIII, this gets even more nuanced. Each character has a few roles, as I mentioned. They can take in the party. Again, think things like attacker, defender, and healer with slightly less gamey words. Commando, Ravager, Medic, Sentinel. Characters can swap roles in the middle of battle. And this is, in fact, one of your primary actions as a player. Rather than pressing buttons to take individual actions, you press buttons to direct the characters on which roles to take. But they don't just change individually. The whole team changes as a set. In advance, you plan out paradigms, which is another great word, which are arrangements of roles. Instead of saying that character A should be a healer now, you say the whole team should enter the combat clinic paradigm, which means that characters A and B are healers and character C is a defender. The concept of identity doesn't simply govern how we define ourselves, our traits as individuals. It also extends to a thing called social identity. And it's not an accident that the same word is used by any means. In many ways, I think it's impossible to talk about identity being fluid without also looking at how we constantly coordinate with the identities of those around us. Sometimes we lean on one identity with one group of people and a somewhat different one with a different group. Sometimes that's a conscious choice because it fits. Sometimes it's a concession to make things work. Sometimes it can feel like a pressure, utterly out of our control. Like, for example, when I turn into a helpless, grumpy teenager whenever I'm around my parents. Final Fantasy XIII reflects that in its paradigms. As you, the player, jump around the narrative, observing different groups of characters, you see how they, the characters, have different types of interactions with each other. You see how they require different paradigms depending on who they're with. The characters intermingle, they separate, they end up in different groups. And you realize now that the character who was always leading the way before now feels better in a more supportive role because they're with different people. And you realize that these things are not set in stone. Each character has a range of roles available to them, and each team has a range of paradigms. It's not infinite, but it's flexible. It's fuzzy and explorable. And these are just a few takes on how identity can be fluid in the moment. In Lufia the Legend Returns, characters have one identifying color trait, so like red, yellow, and some number attached to them. Then they draw on the colors of the characters adjacent to them to use skills which require specific combinations unavailable to any one individual. So that red character is never going to be red and green and blue, but they can be red and borrow the green and blue from their neighbors. Their identities grow via their partners and shift depending on people and position. Fluid identity can have ranges. It can require coordination with others. It can expand or contract at a moment's notice due to relationships with others. It can be changeable without being utterly devoid of restrictions. It has pushes and pulls. It has nuance. I have one more teensy little footnote here. I segued into this fluid identity section with the example of persona main characters. They can swap their inner demons on the fly. The more I thought about this, though, the more something stuck out. You, the player, the main character, can be fluid and free, but the other party members, the people around you, the supporting characters to your story are not. They have one inner demon, and it grows on that familiar straight line path. They change over time along their path, but they don't have the same fluid mechanical freedom that you, the main character, do. I'm reminded of the word sonder from the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows. For those who are not already familiar with it, it is briefly the realization that each random passerby is living a life as vivid and complex as your own. This line of thinking about fluid identity, this particular mechanical expression, simply reminds me that it's not just my identity, which is more fuzzy space with weird shapes rather than hard lines that are easy to see. It's everybody's. It's already a headful to consider my own fluid identity, so it can be even harder to keep that in mind for everybody else. We're getting near the end, I promise. I have thus far talked about numbers and labels and systems and how they might relate to concepts of identity. In talking about identity being fuzzy or fluid, I want to gently open the door to the idea that identity doesn't just have qualities that we can easily put labels to, but also feelings. And a bit like poetry, communicating feelings happens to be something I think games as a medium are great at. There's a world of difference between a story read and a story played. I want to try to describe how games can convey the feeling of identity, not just the nuts and bolts. So a character through words and a character via mechanics and activities. These feelings that you get through play, they're there to speak to and evoke what it's like to be that character. And that, what it is like to be X, is at the heart of identity. Now, these games and mechanics are narrow, they're combat focused, they're limited, often by scope. And of course, they're interpreted through the lenses of creator and player alike, but they can be nonetheless interesting. And there are many interesting examples of this. So Final Fantasy IV, if you, again, saw the other talk, is a favorite of mine where all the characters specifically have jobs which connect in play style to their personal narratives. But here's something a bit different. Here's a brief case study of two characters in the Tales of series, specifically Tales of Vesperia and Tales of Exilia. Rapide from Tales of Vesperia and Rowan from Tales of Exilia. Rapide is a dog. What is it like to be a dog? Well, in Tales of Vesperia, you battle actively. You run around, you swing a weapon. Rapide is a playable character. One of the big differentiating factors between the characters in this game is speed, movement speed. So what does it feel like to be a dog in this game? Fast, free. You have the most speed out of all the playable characters by a solid margin. You have skills that allow you more mobility and agility. What does that have to do with identity? Well, as you play, you're in one place, then you're in another. It's hard to play Rapide. Like, it's honestly difficult to play Rapide and not revel in how much faster you are than ally and enemy alike. You can attack and then run a lap during the enemy's counterattack and be back in time to follow up. By embodying this character, you get certain abilities, and those abilities feel like something. They want to be played a certain way. And there's more. When an ally needs help, you can be there faster than anyone, giving backup where it's needed. You can support others simply by getting in the way and protecting, or by coming up behind and continuing a combo started by someone else. Your only verbs may be run, attack, and defend, but you're always there for your allies. Now, by a somewhat amusing, not quite coincidence, one of the ongoing accidental challenges of the game is that the flying enemies are kind of awkward to hit. They hover just out of reach. They require that you swing upwards or jump in a game that was not really made for that. Now, Rapide, being a dog, is somewhat lower to the ground than the other characters, and maybe you see where I'm going with this. If you are controlling Rapide, you spend a lot of time rapidly circling birds, barking and leaping at them until they come down. So in summary, you're everywhere at once, you're always at an ally's side, and you're chasing out of reach birds. And maybe that's not the essence of dog as character, but it certainly goes a ways towards making you feel some implicit understanding. All of that falls out of the feeling of playing. You don't have a, this is a dog stack. You don't have explicitly support moves. You might be able to guess these things looking at Rapide stats, maybe, but you can't help but feel it when you embody the character. Another example from a different game in the same series is an old general named Rowan. He's tactically minded, capable, magical, and unlike most playable characters in these games, he's old. In combat, he moves slowly. Okay, fine. Old equals slow. Hardly a grand revelation of identity, and not that great, not that interesting. He's also not the strongest in a sword fight. He can't take many hits. He has other tools, as you might expect. He is an incredibly capable magic caster, attacking enemy weaknesses and controlling the battlefield from a distance. More than that, his nickname is the Conductor, and he has a greater deal of control over his spells than other casters throughout the series or even in this specific game. By playing a kind of rhythm game while casting, Rowan can enlarge or move or otherwise modify his spell attacks, giving him even more formidable tactical options. But magic takes time and distance. Rowan, canny tactician he is, also has a variety of trap-like effects he can place on the battlefield to trip up enemies who try to assault him. So we are told that Rowan is an old, tactically brilliant general. That conjures certain things to mind. And when you play him, probably the first thing you notice is how slow he is, how difficult it is to avoid enemies, how frustrating it can be to find a moment to breathe, let alone contribute, while all the other characters dash about, punching and slashing. But as you play with him more, become more proficient, embody his style better, soon you're hardly moving at all. You spot the enemies who may be a problem, and you lay your defenses as appropriate. You find your moments and pick the spell to cast, which may not end the battle, but will ensure it ends favorably. And you bob his rapier/baton in time with the rhythm of the spell, adding an important flourish. The Conductor indeed. So while I have endeavored to convey something a bit different, my descriptions with words will inevitably fall somewhat short of conveying feelings, which is more or less the point of this section. When we start defining characters in terms of numbers and labels and relations between those things, we are undoubtedly working with, implicitly or explicitly, thoughts and assumptions about identity. Analyzing that can be illuminating and interesting, but playing these games is a stark reminder that acknowledging the possibility or shape of an identity, like a fast ninja dog or an old wizard tactician, is different than embodying it and feeling it. Okay, so I'm almost out of time. We're nearing the end here. We've looked at stats and traits, how they can represent and misrepresent identity. We've had a look at systems for growing over time and what they have to say for how we view identity changing over time. We've also looked at a few of the ways in which mechanics can invite us to inspect how fluid identity is and what it feels like. Hopefully, I've given you a few things to think about along the way, especially so if those things give you more lenses and tools for exploring the fuzzy spaces of game design and identity. But there are a handful of additional ways in which JRPGs invite the player to think about these relationships, which are relevant and don't fit neatly into the story so far. So I'm going to just briefly touch on a few more which stand out to me. What can I say? I have a favorite talk structure and I'm going to follow it. So who do you identify with? This isn't necessarily unique to JRPGs. In many games with characters, it is common to have a singular avatar for the player, the vessel for you in that story. This does happen in JRPGs, but sometimes, often I would say, the avatar is a character themselves, independent of the player's intentions. I'm very sorry about that screenshot. I really am. Often the player has direct view of and control over a group of characters, the party, and so is invited to identify with all of and none of them. This is less individual mechanics belonging to characters and more the mechanics of organizing the characters in relation to the player. And again, there's nuance there. In the past, I have described the party in JRPGs as being a bit like a multicellular organism with the player as the brain. The way you choose to relate to, interact with, and organize that organism undoubtedly invites reflection on identity of the typical kind. Who do I relate to? Who do I exclude? Why? At the same time, characters, no matter how rich they are always going to be flatter than a real person. But having multiple characters with no clear neon sign of this one is you, while nevertheless allowing some amount of control, following, and inhabiting, invites more thoughts about identity as a mosaic and a sense of self beyond one body. It also invites reflection on social identity coordination. When you have control of a group, do you try to make them all different and unique? Do you try to make them all the same? Which is easier within the boundaries of the game? Which is encouraged, optimized for? You might select a character from a group to be the main character, like in the Saga games or in Octopath Traveler. This is more like having a singular player avatar, but there's an identity there already, not just a vessel. So there is something there for a player to contrast against, choose to identify with, and to journey alongside. Without going into too much detail, the Bravely series at points acknowledges the player and puts forth questions around the player's relationship to the JRPG characters, even while playing with all the other JRPG standards for characters and party organization. Fire Emblem, a series of games with a large cast of characters at your tactical fingertips, has shifted across the series from treating you, the player, like an invisible hand, playing chess almost, to acknowledging you without giving you a body or presence in the narrative, like looking at the screen and being like, you, tactician, help us in this battle, to placing a player avatar who acts as a kind of supporting character in the narrative and perhaps is a little bit more than that. All the way to placing a player avatar who is indisputably at the center of the narrative action. All of these are different ways to position the player in relation to characters and avatars. Other games with large casts of characters, like Final Fantasy Tactics, sometimes have narratively blank characters, neither a vessel for the player, nor one of the narratively significant characters with narrative baggage. Even this provides a playground for exploring identity within the mechanical boundaries of the game. Whether you're creating your own narrative within the boundaries of the game or drawing more directly from it, it can be a conversation between you and the game about identity. Non-combat interactions. I enjoy interpreting the common threads in JRPGs, reading combat mechanics a bit like a different language, but I always do so aware that there are issues in this. Also hoping that the same emotive and mechanical language, or something like it, could be used in other less combative ways. What does it say about identity if, after all this analysis, the relevant qualities amounts to utility in a fight? How can we spark similar thoughts and lines of inquiry with character mechanics that involve interacting with the world in a way which is not fighting? Octopath Traveler is one of my favorite examples here. It gives each playable character a personalized action with which they interact with NPCs. This obviously says something about the characters, but overlaps between the abilities allow the player a little room to express and explore themselves too. It's not just about using the right tool for the job. You can buy items from NPCs with the merchant, or you can risk a bad reputation and try to steal them. It's honestly not incredibly nuanced, but it still strikes me as really interesting with lots of room to grow. Now I'm going to cheat a little bit. Danganronpa is a series which is much more visual novel-like than JRPG, but it uses active conversation mechanics and character mechanics which overlap with or evoke the types of stats and skills I've spoken about here to link a sense of identity to its somewhat surreal arguments. And I do mean like really surreal arguments, like you're shooting truth bullets at arguments to like literally shoot them down when you sense a falsehood. But the qualities of that, how much time you have to do it, and like how much the reticle like moves or stays still can be stats and are linked to character traits. In lieu of having many great examples of exploration of identity through non-combat character mechanics, however, we do have subversive character mechanics. So there is what I think of as an extensive subgenre of JRPGs, which are keenly aware of the combat focus of these games. And they often explicitly point out and play with what that says about the characters and player, as well as experimenting with what one might identify with in contrast. I've seen them called anti-RPGs, probably drawing from Moon, one of the earlier examples of such a game, which like explicitly called itself an anti-RPG. They use the tropes, trappings, and mechanics of JRPGs to shine a light on the often unexamined norms of the genre. And in doing so, they expand the space for exploring identity. Some of these games treat levels and experience as representing something else, as measures of violence in Undertale, because you're killing to get it, or as measures of love in Moon, where it is only obtained by engaging with spirits and people rather than fighting them. Some anti-RPGs pointedly balance sincerity with humor and silliness, like in Earthbound. And they do this in order to poke at the edges of many of the character mechanics I've discussed, giving them new contexts and interpretations. These games really lay bare when an assumption or trend is left unexamined, and they hint at all the ways the genre might expand to accommodate new types and shapes of identity. Clothes make a person. Fake it until you make it. Masks true selves and inner beauty. Identity is treated as a very inner, often unseeable thing, practically by definition. It has a super complicated relationship with the outer shell, what we show or perceive externally of others. The clothes we wear, the styles we adopt expressively. How do these games explicitly treat external aesthetics? It's no accident that clothing has popped its head up multiple times in this talk previously. JRPG character and costume design are vivid and often intentionally expressive of a character's personality and station. When I spoke about job systems, this is often casually represented by a change of wardrobe. I mentioned equipment as a constant system in these games, but it's rare that the functional clothing and the fashionable clothing overlap. You can wear armor in the status screen and walk around in a black leather jacket and jeans. And isn't that kind of at the heart of the tension between identity and external expression? Can you wear one thing on the outside, but equip something very different on the inside for the identity stats? I've touched upon 2 games where clothing is overtly a major part of the character mechanics, Final Fantasy X-2 and Lightning Returns, both games in which the only playable characters are female. Does that say something about assumptions around gender and clothing and identity? Oh, yeah. I quite like these games, even 10-2 with its wildly and openly girl group vibe, but we can also give it a critical side eye in its obvious association between women and changing clothing all the time or being defined by their clothing. Honestly, maybe I'd just be happier if the boy band that was Final Fantasy 15 had more clothing changes in the mechanics. And look at them. But these kinds of aesthetics extend to more than clothing. And I'm going to end on a JRPG you might not have expected to say lots about identity. Pokemon. In a game, the game in which you are a trainer of little animal-like monsters where all the so-called character mechanics are actually attached to the Pokemon. I'm going to look at one really specific mechanic in Pokemon. In Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, there's an extensive side system called contests. Instead of battling Pokemon physically against each other like you do in the rest of the series, they show off for judges in one of 5 aesthetic categories to see which will be crowned the coolest or the most beautiful. And while it piggybacks a bit on the combat mechanics of the game, this is a substantial system in and of its own. So I'm right. There are several things I like about this system and how it views styles. Before we even get at the system though, I kind of love the categories. So like maybe you can see that cool, smart, beauty, tough, and cute. It's definitely not all inclusive. It is a totally optional system. You can say nope and scuttle away from the contest hole. There's no hierarchy here between the styles. The prize isn't bigger or framed differently for being the toughest or the most clever versus being the cutest. I'm a bit of an identity anarchist anyways, in case you hadn't figured that out by now. So of course it appeals to me that here we have a system where it takes just as much effort and strategy to be seen as smart as it does to be seen as cute. And you get the same size ribbon either way. It just comes down to your preference. And honestly, sometimes I find that the identity that we wear, that we project, or even that we believe is a complicated sort of personal preference. When the Pokemon are judged, first they're judged on their aesthetic condition, which is kind of just its look and vibe. This is just like a stat that belongs to the Pokemon, one for each of the 5 categories. It can be trained mostly by eating. It can be boosted a little bit through appropriate usage of scarves. I mean, honestly, what isn't boosted by appropriate usage of scarves? But what's neat about this is that any Pokemon can aspire to any style. Your Pokemon that people look at and think, "Aw, how cute," could actually be tough. And no system in the game penalizes you for that. Anyone can be anything. There's no, these categories are for this Pokemon type or this gender. Moreover, these stats don't really affect a Pokemon's utility for better or worse in other aspects of the game. Being tough doesn't make your Pokemon stronger in battle. Being clever doesn't make your Pokemon better at special attacks. Your style stats are completely independent of your utility. But style and aesthetics go beyond how you look. It also permeates how you act. The Pokemon in the contest make appeals, which are a lot like a turn-based battle system where you choose actions, just not aimed at hitting the other Pokemon and lowering their health. Every combat action in the game also has an appeal function for contests. Being cool also means acting the part, at least on stage. And this is really interesting to me because if style and aesthetics are not just what you see at a glance, but also permeate action, which I think is a pretty solid assertion, not that controversial. It's not just a weird gamey thing here in Pokemon. Then where do we draw the line with inner or true identity if you still believe in such a thing? The boundaries between the inner and the outer selves start to get a lot fuzzier. And yet we're not saying aesthetics and identity are one and the same or a complete wash, like we can't use these concepts. The Pokemon's contest performance does not completely define them, but it is definitely a part of it. So what is the relationship between style and identity? Ultimately, I think that's pretty personal. But here's what Pokemon has to say about aesthetics and its mechanics. And while I go through, maybe ask yourself what these have to do with identity. Aesthetics are not just a look or a static held property, but an activity as well. Anyone can do any aesthetic. There's no hierarchy between aesthetics, just preference. Aesthetics have no bearing on our utility. And in very rare cases, aesthetics can help a Pokemon or a person transform. Thank you.
Yay.
I'm gonna stop sharing. Sorry, that went a little bit over.
I don't know if we have a few minutes for people to share thoughts at this point, or do you need to go?
Yeah, I can certainly stay for questions. I respect that we've gone a little bit long, but if people want to speak up or put something in the chats, I am happy to engage in discussion because I am clearly the expert on identity. No.
Cool. Okay.
Or we can just chill. I can rest my voice and have a bit of water. It's fine too. Maybe I just said everything that needs said.
It looks like Carlene has something.
Yeah, go for it.
Hi, I'm Destina. Yeah, thank you so much for your fascinating, so interesting and thorough talk. I've made loads and loads of notes. It's just really super. I've got a question. A lot of what you said, considering that a lot of it was on role-playing adventure quests or games, things like mentors, spirits, it reminded me a little bit of the hero's journey, possibly some of the aspects. And in that case, I wondered, the kind of premise, I suppose, of a journey and a hero is that they would want to desire something, they want something, there are obstacles in their way. It naturally leads you to kind of think about the antagonist. So I think your character, your definition of character is very much defined as protagonists or groups of protagonists.
Sure.
I was wondering if you had thoughts about how, the antagonist might work as a character and do some of your investigation, say on the fluidity of characters, that obviously apply, but say the fluidity of a character, items, possibly even growth, would that apply to antagonists as well within these types of games?
Yes, and it's complicated. So I am a sucker for what I call the rival characters. So there are like a variety of different kinds of antagonists in these games. Sometimes it's more like a natural force. Sometimes it's more like a static mwahaha villain style. But I personally, like, my favorite kind of antagonist is sort of the rival, and you have them anywhere from like Pokemon to various Final Fantasies or whatever. In fact, one of my absolute favorite antagonists in a game is actually the game that I kind of shat on during the talk. Final Fantasy 13-2 has an antagonist where you interact with them multiple times over the course of the journey, and they use the same roles and mechanics that you have access to, and it makes it so much more powerful and brings makes their journey a little bit more relatable. So the same way that as you highlighted, I said, like, okay, the main character is more fluid and flexible, and your kind of party in that one, in Persona anyways, is less fluid and flexible. And that says something about how we perceive other people's identities. I would say the antagonist is almost like another step removed. And in some games, they're seen as this very foreign entity. Their mechanics are just completely separate. They're not even like playing the same game as you. And in some games, that's not true. They are absolutely using the same mechanics, playing the same game that you are. All the more so if you get to interact with them multiple times over your journey and see how they change, how they use those mechanics. And so I personally would love to see this sort of thing more, but I definitely think the place to look for that is anywhere where you have like a rival character, where like, I think to the, like if a lot of JRPGs are this ultimately this triumphant hero's journey where you're kind of inevitably going to succeed, the rival characters are always the mirror image of that. They are the tragedy because they are always ultimately gonna lose, and maybe they lose with grace, but or maybe they don't, but they ultimately have to deal with failing in the end, which you kind of, your character, your protagonist doesn't. And I just think that makes them really interesting.
Thank you.
If I can just speak up for a second here, thanks for the talk. I mean, your level of knowledge and insight about all of this is really kind of astounding, and it's clarified a couple of things that have weighed on me, or distinguish some of the things I really love in RPGs, and I love many of the same ones you do, but also some of the ones that have driven me absolutely batty. Because there are a few RPGs, some of which use some of the systems you've mentioned, that really rub me the wrong way. And I think I finally figured out, listening to your talk, maybe why that is. And it's about the relationship between the player and the character. And if you think about that as a relationship between two people, it's not just a relationship of conceptual identities, but like if you have very little influence on how a character's arc will develop, in some sense that distances you from the character, but it's also in some sense a kind of respect. Like you are not driving this character, you're not changing their life, you're observing it evolve and you're learning and maybe inhabiting that character. Whereas if you're very much in the driver's seat and your success or failure at manipulating these stat mechanics will radically change who they are, that feels like, I mean, at least it's a kind of parental role, and maybe even something more contemptuous like a Pokemon trainer or an HR and it makes them feel not like people, or at least not like people you respect very much. You are in command of their fate, and they do your bidding. And especially job systems tend to strike me in that way, where these characters become what you have crafted them to be, these weird, highly technical hybrids. And you can avoid that if you intentionally push against the mechanic, but you're incentivized, I don't know, to treat them as objects in some sense. Whereas if I think about, say, Final Fantasy IV, you don't have that level of control. And that's actually kind of liberating and lets you see them as characters more fully and not have to simultaneously be thinking of them as pets that you are raising up or tools that you are using to sharpen or whatever.
Yeah, so like, I think I alluded to this a little bit in like, so my feelings about, say, the Final Fantasy X system, where originally they started quite disparate from each other, and then like in a later version, they start like very close to each other, and it's really about where you want to send them. And I have personal feelings about that. However, I've also spoken to people who have the reverse, where they very much, like, let's take a job-based system. They very much enjoy the characters that I mentioned, which are more like mannequins, where they kind of get to imbue them with story. And what it forced me to reflect upon is that if the common underlying factor for all these games is that these mechanics clearly evoke and play with ideas of identity, then these are different ways of exploring identity. When the character mechanics are more fixed, it forces this kind of respect for them as an entity. It like the respect for like how that journey is closely tied to who they are. On the flip side, when you have more kind of job-based, treat them like a doll thing, like, and I actually really, like you mentioned like, oh, I'm treating them like a doll, and that has kind of negative connotation, but like children play with dolls, and that has value, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, it's legit.
and you like, and this is like, I'm not ashamed to say, like, I play games, and sometimes I am treating them like dolls, not because like I'm a puppeteer, but because I'm like, I'm figuring something out here. What is this system telling me? Where is the nuance? And I think you mentioned encouraged to engage a certain way. And I think one of the magical things about many JRPGs, though not all, is that because they don't often require like sheer optimization to experience the story, to play them, they require that you're good enough. And that's really interesting because it's not zero pushes and pulls on the character mechanical identities. You do need to kind of engage with the system, but you don't need to find like the absolute highest numbers, most synergies, what is the optimum whatever here to experience the vast majority of the game, at least. And so that kind of allows for exploration.
Yeah, no, I think that's good, and it staves off optimization, which is sometimes wonderful and also sometimes a complete bane of any kind of more narrative experience. No, thanks. That's a really good point.
Cool. All right, so we can all go away and design games about identity and totally have sorted out our own identities as well. I mean, this is fantastic. Anyways, thank you so much for especially, I mean, everybody who came, but those who stuck it out as well, and everybody who had questions and comments. I had a blast making this talk, and I hope you enjoyed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Take care all.
Bye.
Destin.